Good morning. Good morning. Some cool Christmas jazz. Let's see if people slowly start to listen. Might have to pull the lapel up a little bit. I was concerned. Is it good? Just talking to myself. We'll get some audio. This one? Can you guys? Hey, Stephen Rowe. Hey, can you hear me? Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Some of you may recall. It's a Wednesday Wake-Up Club. Some of you recall. But what you may not know, a little-known campaign that happened later in World War II was the Aleutian Islands campaign. If you're listening, if you're a big fan of Slate podcasts, which I'm sure you're not, I listen to them so you don't have to. Learned something last week when I listened. The Japanese reasoned an attack on the territory of Alaska in the summer of 1942 that the Aleutian Islands would prevent a possible U.S. attack across the northern Pacific. Similarly, the U.S. feared that the islands would be used as bases from which to carry out a full-scale aerial attack on the U.S. West Coast by the Japanese. Cities like Anchorage, Seattle, San Francisco, or even as far south as Los Angeles. A battle to reclaim Attu was launched on May 11, 1943, and completed after a final Japanese banzai charge on May 29th. On August 16, 1943, an invasion force landed on Kiska in the wake of sustained 3-week barrage, only to discover that the Japanese had withdrawn from the island on July 29th. The campaign is known as the Forgotten Battle because this is likely the first time you've heard about it in a while. So, of course, December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, was not the only skirmish or attack on the United States from the West Coast. And so I hope that you read up on that, and if you stray into or stumble upon a Slate podcast, it is interesting. Good morning and welcome to Leadership Institute's December Wednesday Wake-Up Club breakfast. Morton is still recovering. If you were here last month, and I hope that you were, the bacon and the grits and the conversation are all fantastic. Morton is still recovering from knee replacement surgery, and as I mentioned last time, and we'll mention again, we are slowly mechanizing him to serve as president of Leadership Institute for much, much longer. I'm honored to be the MC of this breakfast this morning. My name is Matthew Hurd. I'm the Director of Career Services, Graduate Relations, and any number of activities in our career space. You already know what I'm about to say. No. We live in interesting times. In October 2021, the rallying cry across Virginia was Parents Matter. This sentiment swept Glenn Youngkin into the governor's mansion and ushered in a conservative majority in the House of Delegates. Last night, in Loudoun County, the flashpoint of the Parents Matter movement in Virginia, the Loudoun County School Board voted unanimously to fire the superintendent after a special grand jury found that school administrators prioritized their own best interests over the school district and the community in the wake of 2 back-to-back sexual assaults committed by the same student. When people ask me about Virginia elections, and particularly last year, they say, this school issue is big, and there are 4 or 5 subcategories or sub-issues. And you go to Loudoun County, and the issue was this student who had violently, in one instance, sexually assaulted a female student. You no doubt read it in the news and heard about it throughout the course of the campaign cycle. The Democrat chair of the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors, in a meeting that was taking place at the same time the school board was voting unanimously to fire the superintendent, the Democrat chair of the Loudoun County School Board went as far as to call this malfeasance a cover-up by the district. This is a big win for parents, and yes, parents still matter. I encourage you to live tweet this morning's breakfast. The hashtag is on the screen. In 2022 so far, with just a few weeks left to go, your Leadership Institute has already trained 11,763 conservative activists at 502 separate programs. Since 1979, Leadership Institute has trained 254,707 conservative activist students and leaders. You have before you LI's schedule of upcoming trainings right there under the agenda for this program. Please take a moment to review these schools and consider attending one or sending a friend to a training. If you are watching online, we are online this morning. If you're watching online, visit our website at leadershipinstitute.org/training to see upcoming online and in-person trainings. And if I could, I'd like to plug leadershipinstitute.training. We know that you have busy lives. You're balancing work and religious and civic and familial obligations, and encourage you. You can sign up at leadershipinstitute.training and take over 300 hours, more than 300 hours, of content at your leisure, including our very exciting school board programming. So I encourage you to check that out as well. I'd like to welcome, it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day this month because Shakira is with us again. Shakira Jackson is the digital training intern here at Leadership Institute. She will be joining us here in just a moment at the lectern for the pledge and the prayer. She is from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she has worked in both local and national campaigns. Shakira graduated from the University of Pittsburgh, where she majored in political science and history. Shakira holds, more interestingly than the degree, the title of Miss Steel City, affiliated with the Miss America organization, and with her title, Shakira advocates for civic engagement and sustainability. We're very excited to have her here this fall as an intern. While at the University of Pittsburgh, she founded and served as the president of the Network of Enlightened Women, one of our excellent, one of the groups that we work very closely with on college campuses, and the Students for Life chapter. Shakira is continuing her education at Georgetown University and actively working on her own campaign for city council in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. Shakira, if you'll join us for the pledge and the prayer.
Dear God, sometimes I get too caught up in the Christmas commercialization, a lot of times, but today I'm going to refocus my heart and remember why I'm going to celebrate the holidays in the first place. So on Christmas, I'm celebrating Jesus, but the truth is I celebrate you every day and all day, and I pray everyone in this room does the same. We come to worship with a song of thanks in our hearts, a song of redemption, a song of hope and renewal. We pray for joy in our heart, hope in our God, love to forgive, and peace upon the earth. We ask for the salvation of all of our family members and friends, and we pray for your blessings on all people. May there be a bread for the hungry, love for the unlovable, healing for the sick, protection for our children, and wisdom for our youth. Almighty Father, you faithfully provide wisdom and understanding whenever I need help and direction. Help us to remember the countless times you've poured blessings upon us. Comfort us with thoughts of your faith, love, and care, that we may rid our minds and heart of doubts and anxieties. Help us to find wisdom in your faithful promises. In regards to the new year, Father God, we empower man with the will and capacity to work and achieve things for your good pleasure. Cultivate in me the awareness to sense when your hand is at work. Help us to develop the discernment to know which opportunities you are sending our way. Clear our mind and send peace with opportunities that we are not afraid to tackle. Do not allow us to trend an inch and choose wrong or unpredictable opportunities. And grant us the wisdom to learn from every opportunity, whether it's positive or negative, that comes our way. I pray you bless the LI staff and our founder and president, Morton Blackwell. We pray for the forgiveness of anyone who doesn't know you, and fill our hearts with love and power on this day and every day. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
And if you would join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
It'll be tricky. Thank you, Shakira. There we go. There we go. All right, next up to the lectern is my good friend Kirsten Holmberg for a programs update. Kirsten is the Director of Political and Fundraising Training here at Leadership Institute. She's responsible for several of LI's DC-based trainings and workshops, including the Campaign Management School, the Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur School, which she's now held 2 of those this year. I hope that you join us at the next one. The Comprehensive Fundraising Training, and most recently, the Capitol Hill Staff Training. Kirsten, if you'll join us.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Shakira, for that beautiful prayer. This is a season of hope and faith, and as the Director of Political and Fundraising Training at the Leadership Institute, I'm pleased to give a report on our most recent Capitol Hill staff training. This is a training that's been in the Leadership Institute's repertoire for many years, and we're pleased to have brought it back this year. This year we hosted over 80 young conservatives who are interested in working on Capitol Hill. We partnered with some great organizations, including the Conservative Partnership Institute, to bring those students a world-class training that will set them up for success on Capitol Hill. And so we hope that in the new year to hold many more of these Capitol Hill staff trainings that will meet a need that we have on Capitol Hill, and that is effective conservatives on the Hill, both professionally, but also with all of that inside information that you don't get just observing Capitol Hill. So my call to action to you all is, if you are interested, or if you know someone who has a dream to work on Capitol Hill, let me or Matthew Hurt and his division know about that, and we would love to help them succeed on the Hill. So that is my report. I'm very pleased to announce we'll be doing more. There's so many great things that the Leadership Institute has done in 2022, but get ready. 2023 is going to be a great year. So I hope to see you at the next Wednesday Wake Up Call breakfast. And again, if you have any questions about Leadership Institute training, I will be here for a little bit longer, and I would love to chat with you. So thank you all.
And as our Director of International Programs, Ron Nairn, says, we really strive to put on world-class programming. And so if you haven't had an opportunity to see the kinds of programming that Kirsten and Christina and her team put together here, usually in the FM Kirby Training Center, the Capitol Hill Staff Training, the Comprehensive Fundraising Training, the Campaign Management School, it is truly world-class programming. So I encourage you to come yourself if you would like to manage an upcoming campaign. You know, Virginia is for lovers of elections, and we've got some next year. And so there is still time to be a campaign manager. Thank you so much, Kirsten. Of course, none of this good news would be possible without the generous support of Leadership Institute donors, many of whom right now are opening boxes this week filled with Morton's honey. Something like 80,000 boxes, jars of honey are being sent out to donors, supporters, guest faculty, and other friends of Leadership Institute. I hope that when you received yours, the glass was still intact. It is an exciting experience. I'd like to bring up and announce and introduce our breakfast speaker, a friend of mine. My friend Will Estrada is the president of the Parental Rights Foundation and parentalrights.org, where he crafts and crafted model legislation that is adopted by the American Legislative Exchange Council in states across the country to advance parental rights, to advance as we talk about this issue of Parents Matter and what's going on in our schools and what's going on with parents. Will is on the front lines of this. Before joining the Parental Rights Foundation, Will served as a legal assistant with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Many of you may be friends of that organization out in Percival. After he passed the California bar, Will rose to be HSLDA's Director of Federal Relations. He left in 2018 to work in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where he became a career employee in the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division within the Office of Civil Rights. He is a member of the California Bar, so there is help coming for our friends in California. Also the District of Columbia Bar and the U.S. Supreme Court Bar. While at HSLDA, Will worked hard to support key initiatives for that organization, such as reforming state child welfare laws and agencies across the country. Reforming child welfare systems is also a high priority for the Parental Rights Foundation. While at HSLDA, Will also played a key role in defeating the U.S. ratification of the United Nations treaty that threatened parental rights. Will and his wife Rachel live here in Northern Virginia, actually in Loudoun County, I believe, with their two sons, Dominic and Merrick. Please welcome Will Estrada.
Well, Matthew, thank you for those kind words and that introduction. And Matthew, thank you also for mentioning that today is December 7th. And 81 years ago, on December 7th, 1941, as Matthew said, the United States, in the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was suddenly and dastardly attacked. And until the attacks of 9/11, that was still the worst attack on U.S. soil. Hawaii was not yet a state, but it was still U.S. soil until the attacks of 9/11. And so I'm reminded of our veterans. There are very few of the World War II veterans left. Obviously, it was 81 years ago today that the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor. My wife, she's half Korean, and her grandfather was a translator at age 15 for the GIs in the Korean War, and maybe he actually just passed away 2 days ago. And maybe about 5 years ago, I was like, this is history. I need to ask him about this. So I said, Grandpa Ree, can you tell me a little bit about what it was like being a translator? And he just paused for a moment, and then he started crying, and he said, I will never talk about those days in the Korean War. And so World War II, we all remember Vietnam War, but the Korean War is also called one of those forgotten wars. And so I'm grateful for our veterans, and today is a day that we should definitely remember those World War II veterans. It's good to be here today with all of you. I see my fellow Loudoun County neighbor, retired Major General Jeff Phillips, who lives in Leesburg. Jeff is also the head of Reserve Officers of America. So, Jeff, good to see you. I remember that there's an easy mnemonic. I'm going to give you some free training here to remember generals. It's called Be My Little General. Brigadier General, 1 star, Major General, 2 star, Little, Lieutenant General, 3 star, and then General, 4 star. And Ike, was Eisenhower the last 5-star general in the United States?
He ultimately had 26 stars, I think.
26 stars, okay. So officially 5 stars. And then to see so many other friends, old and new. I see Juanita, who I served with at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and Rita as well, who just came on at LI. So it's an incredible honor to be here with all of you. Just want to highlight also the Leadership Institute training. I'll be back on December 13th doing a grassroots lobbying workshop. But really the star of that is going to be Bridget Ziegler. She is a newly elected school board member in the Free State of Florida. And so it's an online program, December 13th. I think it's 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So would encourage you, get that out to your networks. Leadership Institute does some phenomenal training, and so it's an honor to be here and to be talking with all of you. All right, I think I have, good. I do have my my slideshow up there. So as Matthew said, I'm a Pennsylvania resident. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I was homeschooled the whole way. I'm the oldest of 8 kids. My dad's Puerto Rican, my mom's Italian, and just kind of looping everything together of homeschooled and December 7th. Homeschoolers don't really get out that much, although we're great people. I've got to say that. I'm paid to say that because I was a homeschool graduate. And I'll never forget when I was 13 years old, we were going over the Pearl Harbor attacks, where, of course, FDR said the United States was suddenly and dastardly attacked. So my mom said that, and I'm like, Mom, there's no such word as dastardly. The real word that he said is, and I put a B there in front of the D, because I thought that was what he said. And my mom got this funny expression on her face, and she's like, no, go look in the dictionary what that word is. So Homeschoolers are great people. We homeschool our kids, actually, and we live in Loudoun County. And just to reiterate what Matthew said, I did not expect to see last night the school board of Loudoun County fired Scott Ziegler, the terrible school district superintendent in Loudoun County. And that was a 9-0 vote. And we have 6 Democrats on the school board, only 3 Republicans in Loudoun County. So, as I always say, parental rights are bipartisan. I'm here at LI, which is nonpartisan, so parental rights are bipartisan. I want to talk today about 3 different things, kind of covering my 19 years so far of professional work. So, federal conscience laws, what I did at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and not speaking for HHS, I'm just sharing historical tidbits of what I did there. Then homeschooling, and then want to spend the most of my time today and be mindful of your time as well, talking about the work that we're doing at Parental Rights Foundation that we've been doing for 15 years to advance and protect parental rights. All righty, and then leave time for questions. Clicker, there we go. So when I always said, and you should always be careful saying, you know, that my mom always said is never say never. I always said I will never be a federal bureaucrat. They're just those blood-sucking ticks. There's a great book by Daniel Hannan called The New Road to Serfdom. Has Daniel Hannan ever been at LI to speak? He was a British MP, and his book, The New Road to Serfdom, is phenomenal. And I read that, I think in high school, actually. Maybe it didn't come out in high school. But I read it a while back, and he was talking about the administrative state. And of course, in Europe, the administrative state is much worse than the U.S. And so I was like, oh, this is terrible. We got to dismantle the administrative state. So I always said I would never be a federal bureaucrat. So after 16 years at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, I had actually been on the Trump transition team on education. I was offered a position as a political in the U.S. Department of Education. And there were 2 things going against that. The first is I think the U.S. Department of Education is really the most unconstitutional agency. And so I was like, how could I go work at the U.S. Department of Education? I think it should be either shut down or drastically downsized. And all those decisions put at the state level, so state's Department of Education, and then, of course, local control. But then the second thing was my wife and I were expecting our second child, and my wife had a lot of complications with our first, and so I was like, there's no way, you know, in the first 100 days I could be a good husband and good dad and be a good, you know, career political official in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. So I said no, and then I watched everything the Trump administration was doing, and I was having regret. I was like, oh, they're doing great work. I wish I was there. And so in 2018, Roger Severino, who was the head of the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, political appointee in the Trump administration, he stood up the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division. It was a subdivision of Office for Civil Rights at U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And I applied on USA Jobs and was hired as the 3rd career official in this new department to enforce these laws and some others that are federal conscience laws that have been on the books since right after the decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973. You would remember when the Supreme Court said that there was a constitutionally guaranteed right to an abortion, which they eliminated in the Dobbs decision just this year and sent it back to the states, which is where it should be. It should be closer to the people. There's not anything in the Constitution, despite the U.S. Supreme Court saying it was in the penumbras and emanations, and so it should be left to the states. And some states will have some laws on abortion, other states will have different laws, and that is our democratic system of government. And if you don't like it, amend the Constitution to put it in there. But these laws, after 1973, they were almost all bipartisan and unanimous, and they were to just protect conscience rights in the issue of abortion, so that no one was being forced to perform an abortion, those sort of things. And these laws have never been enforced. And so the work that we were doing at the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division was incredibly exciting to implement, to enforce these laws that have been on the books but have been almost essentially ignored for decades. And I just want to real quick run through them because I don't know if we have civil rights lawyers in the room or listening, but these laws are still not really well known, and they really protect a lot of important rights when it comes to conscience in the area of healthcare. So the church amendments, I've got the code up there on the screen, the Coates-Snow Amendment, both of these protect against anyone being forced to perform abortions or sterilizations. The sterilization aspect is very intriguing when it comes to some of the issues regarding transgender issues. So if people are being pressured to conduct surgeries, then these amendments might be applicable. The Weldon Amendment is an appropriations rider that's been attached to every single federal budget bill since 2004, saying that if you're receiving these funds through HHS, that you cannot pressure people to perform an abortion, refer for an abortion, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really just trying to neutralize the playing field, not saying you can't as doctors or nurses, but saying no doctor or nurse should ever be forced to perform an abortion. And then Section 1553 of the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare, is a very intriguing federal law that actually says no one should be forced to perform or assist in the performance of euthanasia. I hope you've all seen some of the news coming out of Canada of how doctor-assisted suicide is now being used for mental health issues. Remember when Dr. Kevorkian and euthanasia was being discussed, it was always for people who were terminal, and now it's being extended to teenagers who are struggling with mental health issues, which is deeply, deeply troubling of what's happening to our friends in the North. So it was an honor to be working on these laws. One of the things that we worked on was we issued a final rule implementing these statutes. It was codified in the Federal Register at 84 Federal Register, page 23,170, on May 21st, 2019. It was immediately stayed by the federal courts, so we never were able to implement it. But it was a lot of fun working on these regulations, drafting regulations. So I've drafted legislation, I've drafted regulations, and going back to Daniel Hannan with the new road to serfdom, and I hope I don't get thrown out on my ear for saying this, before I went into the federal government as a bureaucrat, I always said the greatest threat to freedom are federal bureaucrats. And then when I got in, I really saw how limited, at least in the United States legal system, I see some of you nodding your heads, is with the bureaucrats. The only reason that bureaucrats and federal agencies are able to get away with so much is because at any given time, half of Congress likes what they're doing. So when it's a Republican administration, the Republicans in Congress like what the bureaucrats are doing. When it's a Democrat administration, the Democrats in Congress like what the bureaucrats are doing. If ever Congress just said, we just want to make the decisions and get rid of the bureaucrats, they could so easily do it, but it's a system of our system of government. And then also the courts, and it's unlike that for our friends in Europe, like Daniel Hannan with the new road to serfdom, the courts are very empowered under the Administrative Procedures Act and other federal laws to have oversight and significantly regulate the regulatory process by the federal agencies. So after having been in the belly of the beast, in the swamp as a bureaucrat, I really said, it's fascinating, that perspective that I was able to see. And how I think if we as American citizens are involved in the regulatory process, filing public comments, talking to our elected officials, we can really rein in the administrative state. So it was very, very interesting, and wanted to share that with you. And just my last PSA, the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, when President Biden came in, and I served through 2 administrations for the first year of the Biden administration before I came on as the president of Parental Rights Foundation and resigned from the federal government. The Biden administration tried to shut down the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, but as of now, more than 2 years into the Biden administration, the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division is still open. It's still operating. That's their webpage. It's hhs.gov/conscience. I just checked this Friday, and it's still there. So if you know of doctors or nurses who are being pressured to perform an abortion, refer this to them. Complaints can be filed. There's no private right of action for these federal laws that we talked about. The only enforcement is through the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division at the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There's still good, dedicated civil servants that are there. And so I always joke that the Democrats are not really good at shutting down government programs, so they haven't figured out how to shut down the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division as of yet. And I know there are members of Congress that are still talking about it as well. So that's my little discussion about one aspect of what I've done in my career. I've been blessed in almost 19 years of professional work, always having a job that I love doing. And I don't take that for granted, and I am very grateful to God for that. So the first 16 years of my professional career, I worked at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, of course, as you remember, founded by Mike Farris. Mike was very close to Morton Blackwell. Morton is one of those great Americans who has just created organizations. Mike Farris is another. HSLDA was founded in 1983, and the mission, back then, homeschooling was illegal in most of the 50 states. Today, it's legal in all 50 states. It's legal in a lot of countries as well. We hear about countries like Germany or Sweden Sweden, where homeschooling is illegal. But the interesting story is most countries actually have some form of homeschooling that is still legal. But in the United States, it's the most free environment and the majority of people being homeschooled. One of the key things I worked on at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association was making sure that federal law protected homeschool freedom. We did not want to define homeschooling in federal law. We just said, leave us alone. And so a very important law, this was first put into No Child Left Behind in 2001. John Boehner, love him or hate him, was a friend of homeschoolers and a friend of school choice, charter schools, and he ensured when he was the chairman of the House Education and Workforce Committee that this language is put in. Then I worked to make sure it was included in the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, but it's 20 U.S. Code, section 7886. Go take a look at it. It says if homeschools, private schools that do not receive federal funds are completely exempt from any federal control in education. And then finally, it's been incredible to see the massive growth in homeschooling. Pre-COVID, around 3% of school-age kids. By any estimate, there's probably around 50 million school-age children in the United States of America right now. So pre-COVID, it was around 3% of students who were homeschooled, around 2 million students. So maybe it's more around 80 million as K-12 students. That number fluctuates, of course. Post-COVID, that number has gone from anywhere between 6% to 11%. Some of those estimates, it's hard to know because some states like California and Texas, you don't even have to register as a homeschooler, and those are some of the states with the most growth in homeschooling. So it's really hard to know. I've seen some estimates as high as 9 million students are being homeschooled in the U.S. today. I think it's probably more between 6 and 7 million, but by any metric, it's massively grown. One of the fun things I worked with at Homeschool Legal Defense was to ensure that homeschoolers could enlist in the U.S. military. There was a time where homeschoolers are being denied entrance into the military. So twice we went into the National Defense Authorization Act. We amended it to ensure that homeschoolers were able to enlist, same as any other high school graduate, to be able to serve their country in the U.S. military. And here's a nice map that really shows the 50 states, the laws governing homeschooling. I was homeschooled first in New York. My dad is a former special ed teacher for the state of New York, and then in Pennsylvania. So you will see those two states have the most restrictive laws regarding homeschooling. There has to be a certified teacher evaluation, annual reports, testing. But the vast majority of the country, as you can see, there's either no notice, very low regulation, or even moderate regulation. Virginia is here classified by Homeschool Legal Defense as a moderate regulation state. There are options in Virginia. For example, our family, we use the religious exemption where we say that we believe that we should be homeschooling our children because that's what God has called us to do. We live in Loudoun County. And once you do that, there's really no regulation so long as you're providing a good education to your children. So it's really an incredible story to see how sometimes it's easy to look at the headlines and think, oh, things are so bad, we're losing freedom. But it's also sometimes that story that you don't hear of how freedom has been fought for. It's been a battle, but we've gained more freedom. And homeschooling is definitely one of those. When homeschooling first started as a major movement in the 80s, it was illegal in most of the 50 states. Today, it's legal in all 50 states, incredibly free. Gun rights is another issue, and Grover Norquist, who's on our board at Parental Rights Foundation, always talks about this. He wrote a great book called Leave Us Alone. Encourage you to read it. He talks about how concealed carry, for example, or gun rights, there's been massive victories. Taxes. When the income tax first came out, and then the golden days of Hollywood, 99% of high-income earners was being taken by the federal government through federal taxation. That's just, we can't even imagine that today. And I think one of the reasons we've seen growth of so much industries and so many Americans who are billionaires, and some people hate that, but they're creating jobs, they're helping our country compete on the global economy, and that's another example of how we've had so much freedom as well. So I love this map. Credit to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, where I worked for 16 years. And then now I want to talk about parental rights, kind of spend the bulk of the rest of our time and then open it up for questions from you on any of these issues. Stump the chump. You can ask me any sort of questions you want, so think about it. But I've been honored to be the president at Parental Rights Foundation. It's near and dear to my heart. Parental Rights Foundation was also founded by Mike Farris back in 2007, so we just celebrated our 15th year of operation. The funny thing was, for the majority of our time, it's been parental rights are under attack. We need to protect parental rights, either a constitutional amendment or litigation or state legislation to protect parental rights. And up until 2000, the response I would always get was, What you have a solution in search of a problem. Parental rights are protected. What are you worried about? We have all of our parental rights. And we were like, no, there's threats to parental rights. We see it with our work. And then after COVID and with the issues with the schools, everyone agrees now that parental rights are under attack. And the question is then, what should we do to protect them? So it's been very interesting to kind of see that. I remember distinctly in 2011, I was giving a speech in Mississippi about parental rights, and 6 people showed up to speak at that. So I was like, man, no one really is worried about parental rights, but now we've all really seen what's going on. The first important thing to remember is that parental rights, broadly speaking, are fundamental. There's a line of Supreme Court cases. I'm going to break down a little bit of them. Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923, Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925, Wisconsin versus Yoder in 1972, Troxel versus Granville as recently as 2000, which was the last time the U.S. Supreme Court took a parental rights case. But the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's many other cases up in between those times as well, where the U.S. Supreme Court has said that parental rights are fundamental. The interesting thing is it's not in our Constitution. For the first 150 years of our country, it was unquestioned that parental rights were fundamental. That the Constitution, we're conservatives, the Constitution is there not to give us rights, but to protect our God-given or fundamental rights. That's the purpose of government. So there was really no reason to put it into the Constitution. But starting I would say in the early 1900s, 1910, 1915, and remember what was happening. There was a lot of xenophobia. It was anti-Catholic bias. It was anti-immigrant bias. It was anti-Jewish bias, because these were the poor European immigrants who were fleeing to our country. And that really began to be the battle of parental rights in our country. And it was primarily focused on education. So 1923, Nebraska had passed a law saying that children could not be taught in any language other than English. Mr. Meyer was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska, and he was teaching young German immigrants how to read, and he was using the Bible. So he had a German Bible that he was teaching them how to read, teaching them to read, then he could teach English, and he was prosecuted under Nebraska's xenophobic law, and the case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. He was convicted, so the case went up to the Supreme Court on appeal. The Supreme Court struck down Nebraska's law, and I love the line that they had, because this is the first time that the U.S. Supreme Court said parental rights are fundamental. The individual has certain fundamental rights which must be respected. Without doubt, it denotes not merely freedom from bodily restraint, but also the right of the individual to contract, to engage in any of the common occupations of life, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry, establish a home, and bring up children, to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience, and generally to enjoy those privileges long recognized at common law as essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness by free men. 2 years later, another case came up where the U.S. Supreme Court said it even more strongly. Pierce versus Society of Sisters. This was primarily an anti-Catholic law. Oregon had passed a law that pretty much banned all private education. Kids had to go to public school. And the reason was they didn't want those dirty Roman Catholics having their Catholic schools and teaching children about God. I mean, basically, that's what it was. And remember, also at this time, this was when you had a lot of the Blaine amendments. Senator Blaine had tried to do a constitutional amendment prohibiting any money going to sectarian schools. It failed by 1 vote. Then he brought up state statutes, which today are still the Blaine amendments. And how many of you remember that Supreme Court case where Justice Sam Alito included in his concurrence a picture showing these like crocodiles with like miters, like the Catholic bishops would have, attacking these children, and there's Senator Blaine standing athwart history on the bank of the river beating back these Catholic crocodiles. That was the example of anti-Catholic bias that our country has had for a long time. It makes kind of JFK's election. Remember that with the he's going to be have allegiance to the Pope instead of the Constitution. That's the environment that our country had for a long time. We still see anti-Catholic bias. It's Little Sisters of the Poor, that sort of stuff. And I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm Protestant, but I love my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. So anyway, Oregon passed a law banning private education. There were 2 private schools that sued. One was kind of a military boarding school, and the other one was Society of Sisters, a Roman Catholic private school. So they filed suit. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down Oregon's law, and here's the great sentence that is still good law, and it's relied on by courts all across the country. The fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. Mic drop right there. Wisconsin versus Yoder, 1972, another big parental rights case. This case involved old order Amish and some of the strict sects of the Mennonites in Wisconsin. They wanted their kids to leave public schools at 8th grade so they could learn to be farmers, they could learn their traditions. Remember back then in public schools, 8th grade was basically, first year of college today, because we've had such inflation with education of 8th graders could do Pythagorean theorem and advanced mathematics. And these families were actually prosecuted under the truancy law in Wisconsin. The jury was very sympathetic. They gave them the minimum fine possible of $5 to each family. And remember, Amish, I grew up in Pennsylvania. We have a very large Amish and Mennonite community. Amish and Mennonites are nonviolent. So they were going to, not nonviolent, they don't generally fight the government. So they were going to pay the $5 fine, but they had people who came alongside of them and said, this is a very dangerous precedent. Please, would you consider appealing? We'll represent you for free. They did appeal. Thankfully, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the compulsory attendance law in Wisconsin as applied to these religious families and overturned their $5 fine and said this case involves the fundamental interest of parents as contrasted with that of the state to guide the religious future and education of their children. The history and culture of Western civilization reflect a strong tradition of parental concern for the nurture and upbringing of their children. This primary role of the parents in the upbringing of their children is now established beyond debate as an enduring American tradition. And then 2000 was a grandparent visitation case that came out of the state of Washington and the U.S. Supreme Court. It was kind of a confusing decision, but the plurality opinion, that means that there were multiple opinions of having different reasons for protecting parental rights, but the plurality opinion said, the liberty interest at issue in this case, the interest of parents in the care, custody, and control of their children, is perhaps the oldest of the fundamental liberty interests recognized by this court. In light of this extensive precedent, it cannot now be doubted that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment protects the fundamental right of parents to make decisions concerning the care, custody, and control of their children. This is the Supreme Court precedent that we have, and it's been very strong for parental rights. The difficulty, however, the but, is that these are all cases that really have enshrined the right of parents to choose the type of education for their children. And so a lot of the controversies that we've seen recently deal with how much control parents should have in the public school. So it's not really a clear issue because, these other cases have said you have a right to choose private schools. You have a right to basically choose a homeschool. You have the right to make decisions for your children. But when they're in public school, there does have to be a balancing so we don't have the public schools, basically fall apart with everyone wanting different things. So in the past, basically 25 years, the federal circuit courts have filled the gap, and the decisions in general have not been good for parental rights in the public school classroom. I'm just going to give you a few if you want to take a picture of it and look at them later. Fields versus Palmdale School District. Fields, the original 3-judge panel, had a terrible line which said, parental rights end at the schoolhouse door. And you'll usually see that line quoted. The good thing that a lot of people forget, however, is the family said, this is an egregious decision, and they sought an en banc decision, which is where the entire Ninth Circuit would have ruled on this. They got a denial of the en banc petition, but I've got the citations, 447 F3rd 1187 from 2006. The panel realized, okay, we went a little too crazy in our original decision, and so they walked back a couple of their more egregious lines in the decision, and they got rid of their line about the rights of parents end at the schoolhouse door. So if ever you look at Fields versus Palmdale, also go look at the denial of the en banc petition. I know I'm a little bit in the weeds at 8:45 in the morning here for lawyer talk. Sorry, I am a lawyer. Don't shoot me as we go out, please. But it did walk back some of the more egregious provisions in that original decision. Blah versus Fort Thomas Public School District, another decision that really restricted parental rights in the classroom. Wood versus Arnold, that's here Fourth Circuit. So that's Virginia's controlling precedent. That one actually was the Supreme Court denied cert. CN versus Ridgewood Board of Education, and then, of course, Parker versus Hurley, which actually I think is the worst decision for parental rights in the public school classroom, and that's a First Circuit decision. That one was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied cert. So these are the controlling precedents. Supreme Court has, for a while, basically been like, well, we don't want to get involved in this. The interesting thing about all these circuit court decisions, however, is, and it's summed up in this federal district court decision that I'm going to cite, is that the courts have said, we don't want to get involved in if you don't like the curriculum. Some of these were sex ed books. Some of these were, as far back as like 2005, LGBT books that parents objected to on the basis of their religious beliefs. Some were dress code cases. The federal circuit courts have generally said in those decisions that I had in the previous slide, don't bring these cases to us. If you don't like what's going on in the public schools, change your state law, like Florida did with their parental rights bill in 2021, or their parental rights in education, better known as the Don't Say Gay bill, here in 2022 regarding public education, or get involved in school boards, school board races. That's what the federal courts have said. No federal, don't come to us with your issues, change the school boards, or get state laws changed. And that's what school boards are doing. Moms for Liberty is doing fantastic work on school board races, and a lot of school boards have flipped as well. This case is a case that's pending from the Eastern District of Mississippi. A school board, the elections flipped. The parents got fed up with what was going on. The new school board came in. They pulled some of the books. One of the books was The Bluest Eye, which has some very explicit provisions. They didn't pull these books were not part of the curriculum, but they were being kind of marketed to the kids in the public school libraries, and so the new school board said, we're pulling these books out of the school library. ACLU and some of the other organizations filed suit and said, this is a book banning case, and the federal judge went to town on them. He said, this is not a book banning case. I encourage you to read the case. You can Google it. There's a citation if you have Westlaw or Lexis or anything. The judge said, this is not a book banning case. This is just a school board exercising what the parents and the voters want, of saying we're not going to have certain books in the library, but the kids can still bring them in their backpacks. They can read them at home. They can read them in the classroom. It's just not going to be featured on the public school library shelf. And it's still pending. It's been appealed by the ACLU up to the federal circuit court. But there was a great line here, and the federal district court upheld the school board policy and said the education of the nation's youth is primarily the responsibility of parents, teachers, and state and local school officials, and not of federal judges. So just something to think about as you see these cases that many good organizations are currently filing suit on behalf of parents around the country. I'm not sure the Supreme Court's going to say there's a role for the federal courts. They might just say we're going to leave this to school boards, because it does really get into an interesting situation. If the federal courts are jumping in, are you going to apply it to conservative school boards, liberal school boards? So who knows? You know, when you get 10 lawyers in a room, you get 11 opinions. So this is just Will Estrada's one question that I'm wondering about how these cases are going to pend, but wanted to share that with you. Some of the other work that we're doing are state parents' bills of rights. We're trying to codify in state code that parental rights are fundamental. This protects parents in CPS investigations, innocent parents. This protects parents and when they are trying to fight their school board or trying to have issues protecting parental rights. 15 states currently have some form of a law that protects parental rights as fundamental. West Virginia, Kansas, Michigan, Texas, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Virginia. Virginia's we worked on, that was 2013. It was silent. No one did anything with it until Governor Youngkin got elected. Oklahoma, Idaho, Wyoming, Florida, Montana, and Georgia just this past year, 2022, legislative session became the 15th state to codify in state code that parental rights are fundamental. I just wanted to put up on the text, here's what Virginia's law, we've been working on all of these. This has been one of our top priorities as an organization for 15 years. And when I came in, I was like, we got to pour diesel fuel on this. And we're talking to legislators around the country. We could see this 15 state list double to 30 states. I think, in 2023, because it's been very exciting to see state legislators join in. But you can see it's a very simple code. 1-240.1 here in Virginia, a parent has a fundamental right to make decisions concerning the upbringing, education, and care of the parent's child. And then that paragraph 2, it's a great decision from the Virginia Supreme Court from 2013, LF versus Bright. And what that said, and again, getting into the weeds, is that a fundamental right, courts apply strict scrutiny or the compelling state interest test before they restrict a fundamental right, which is the highest level of scrutiny that courts apply to a governmental action. Won't go more into that because it is 8:50 on a Wednesday morning and we just had breakfast, but strict scrutiny is very important for a fundamental right. You can see some of the examples of how a Governor Youngkin, Lieutenant Governor Sears, an Attorney General Mieres can enforce these state laws. It's codified at 1-240.1. Governor Youngkin has relied on it on multiple executive orders. The Virginia Department of Education has relied on this statute in model policy for school boards. We're seeing even Loudoun County and Fairfax County having to put more parental rights into opt-out, into explicit text, so that, again, parents can't control all the education, but they can opt their children out and exercise their parental rights. Bedford County School Board relied on 1-240.1 in on a parental rights resolution, and then we've been potentially getting into litigation. We relied on it in a letter that we recently sent to the Fairfax County School Board. Want to close there and then open it up. Do we have a few minutes for questions? Okay, Matthew says we have a few minutes for questions. Got my email there if you want my slideshow, if you want to see any of these citations. My cell phone number is there, easily accessible. My Twitter, if you want to follow me for spicy takes, is Will_Estrada, and then our organization, our 501c3 nationwide organization, is parentalrightsfoundation.org. So questions? Juanita.
Last night's resignation of Scott Ziegler. So what's your fearless forecast heading into? Thank you. With last night's resignation of Scott Ziegler, what are you hearing and seeing or predicting for next year's local races in Virginia, not just Loudoun County, but throughout Virginia, where parents have been out there? Ian Pryor's been a leader out in Loudoun and others to impact and start switching these seats around, that not only on sexual harassment, but the content, the liberal content, transgender, everything going into the schools.
Yeah, so great question, Juanita, about Loudoun County. There once was a time in our country's history. How many of you have read the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House on the Prairie books? Remember when Pa runs for school board and it was a terrible disaster because everyone hated him? And there once was a time in so school board issues are not new, but there once was a time in our country where the school board races were the most important elections. And, I love elections. I think, Virginia, as Matthew said, Virginia is for lovers of elections. But we've got to get out there in these school board races. We've got to get our friends to them. Honestly, they have more impact on our kids' lives and our daily lives than the presidential election does. All elections are important, but, we're going to win some, we're going to lose some. Some school districts, maybe where we're standing right now is pretty, I don't know if we're going to win them. But we've got to make it where school board elections are the most important. Again, and get good people elected, because that really is what I think the only way to win. Okay, you had your hand up? Yeah, and then over there.
I just want to know, with Betsy DeVos, did she accomplish anything with the Department of Education when she was in?
So the question is, Betsy DeVos, did she accomplish anything at Department of Education? I love Betsy DeVos. She is a fighter, and she came into U.S. Department of Education and did as much as she could do. And that kind of goes to what I said about being, about the administrative state. There's not really a whole lot that can be accomplished, particularly of lasting change. I think she did as much as could be. Some of the things that the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education did, opening an investigation into some of the waning days of the Trump administration. I think it was the president of Princeton said, we are a supremacist organization, speaking of Princeton, that has discriminated against people of color. I'm Latino. And so Department of Education said, oh, have you violated federal civil rights laws, and opened an investigation. Now, of course, that got shut down under the Biden administration, but what she did laid a groundwork that a future Ron DeSantis administration, I know I can't say that, future administration can come in and pick that up and lay the groundwork. As long as we have presidential elections every 4 years, it flips, not a whole lot is going to get done because, and the example is the Obama Title IX regulations. In the waning years of the Obama administration, they redefined Title IX to include gender identity, would have major ramifications for public schools, colleges, et cetera. And immediately Trump came in and shut down that. Then Trump did a Title IX regulation that kind of went back to the traditional understanding of Title IX as Congress had passed it 50 years ago. And then Biden comes in and immediately shuts it down. So we need an administration to go for 8 years so it can wind its way through its court so the Supreme Court can ultimately rule. As long as we have 4-year good, it's good for regulation, but it's going to be hard for anyone to get anything accomplished. So it's a good question. I think Betsy DeVos did as much as she could do, and she's actually one of my heroes. So I'm very grateful for what she's done. Yeah.
If you have a question, please wait for the microphone. Thank you.
We got
Thank you.
scolded.
Hi, I'm Rob Whitfield. Back in 1996, I was there when Chuck Grassley and Steve Largent had a hearing on the Parental Rights and Responsibilities Act. And I got into the hearing room. It was only then I read that the legislation excluded the rights of parents in separation and divorce. I don't think anything has happened in the last 25 years, and still today, judges with very little factual basis are making determinations on child custody which are frankly horrible. And the gentleman sitting in this room who I met, and I went to Texas to see his kids. He gets to see them one weekend a month for a couple of hours each afternoon. And I just don't think judges have any morals or conscience in domestic relations matter. What do you propose can be done to help us?
Great question. I'm glad you brought up that 1996 Grassley and Largent Act, because we're trying to amend the Constitution to put fundamental parental rights in the Constitution. Debbie Lesko from Arizona just introduced House Joint Resolution 99, which is our proposed constitutional amendment. Their parental rights is not an issue in custody matters, and here's why. It's when mom and dad disagree. And when you have the two parents disagreeing, it's no longer a parental rights issue because it's really an issue of whose parental rights should the court get involved in. So it's a difficult situation. I have close family members who've gone through it. I'm sure everyone here in the room either has personally or knows someone who's gone through a divorce. And the courts have to, we don't get involved in those. Because if the parents are disagreeing and going to kind of the judge to decide best interests, it's no longer the state impinging on a fundamental right. It's an argument of whose parental rights should be primarily responsible. So thank you for raising that question. Not a good answer. Matthew, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Do we have time for one more question? Or? Oh, okay, we do have one more question. I see two hands. So, all right, real quick.
Okay, my name's Janice Wohl Grenadier, and I launched judicialpedia.com, a place where people can put their cases. We were able, Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice Donald Lemons had to resign last December because of the cases that are up there. We have a problem in Virginia with our judges, and there's simply no oversight over them. We have one option, and that is the grand jury. We have the right to go in front of the grand jury and ask for a special grand jury to investigate the cases when the judges overstep their authority and their discretion, and we're being blocked. I'm trying to get one down in Culpeper, Virginia, and have argued in front of the judge 8 times. The judges and our Commonwealth attorneys are acting like kings. So our forefathers had the great sight to see that they had given too much power to Article 1, 2, and 3, the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary. And now it's we, the people, that need to use our fourth arm of government, which was codified under Justice Powell and Justice Scalia, giving us the right to do that, but we need help doing it.
Let's talk afterwards about that. I'm very
Thank you.
intrigued by that. And then final question, real quick, back there, the lady in the back.
Hello, good morning. My name is Anita Pambara Cox, and I just ran for state senate over in Maryland. And school choice, parental rights was very big. Every time I knocked on people's doors, if I found toys in front of the house, I would bring up that issue. They did bite. They were interested. They would like parental rights, as opposed to, say, school choice. But it never translates at the ballot box. Of course, we're talking about Maryland, it was like a long shot. But what would you have to say about that sort of in the weeds connecting with the people who would enable us to bring the kind of change that we're looking for?
That's a
Thank
great
you.
question, and you're correct. Parental rights are bipartisan. The school board, the San Francisco voters, which is MAGA country, they voted out 3 of their school board members earlier this year over parental rights. I think as we're talking about candidates and races, a lot of it matters on how we frame it and the opponents. And the classic example is Glenn Youngkin. Glenn won in basically a purple state. And he didn't make any mistakes. And people smarter than me have talked about how to translate that into other states. It's not always going to win. I think in 2022, parental rights is a big issue, but there were other issues as well that maybe that was affected some of the races we were involved in. Let me talk to you afterwards because I'm not 100% sure myself. With that, I'll turn it over to Matthew Hurt. Thank you for having me.
Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. Will, I would like to present to you an Adam Smith tie.
Oh my goodness.
Which you could actually change into before the rest of your meetings.
It's like an Adam Smith, like Wealth of Nations.
So Wealth of Nations. In fact, the Leadership Institute is the sole creator, producer of Adam Smith ties here domestically in the U.S. This is our gift to you. Thank you so much, Will. Appreciate it. Thank you for all the work that you do fighting for parental rights. The question a moment ago was do these issues translate at the ballot box? And with Bridget Ziegler, our Director of School Board Trainings, we have seen dozens, and we will see hundreds of moms and dads, qualified, competent candidates for school board, oftentimes nonpartisan, get elected across the country. Bridget Ziegler, our Director of School Board Trainings in Sarasota, Florida, she's now in her 3rd term on the school board, where just a few weeks ago she flipped the Sarasota School Board from 4-1 woke to 3-2 Parents Matter majority. And we're seeing it, even Miami-Dade County elected a majority Parents Matter school board in November. So thank you again. Thank you, Will, so much for joining us. I encourage you, all of you, to join us at our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast on January 4th, a day after another very exciting activity where the House is scheduled to elect the Speaker of the House on January 3rd. So hopefully we'll have some exciting news the next morning. If you can't join, you can register online, RSVP online at leadershipinstitute.org/breakfast. And we are in the midst of the Christmas and Hanukkah season. For those of you who celebrate Hanukkah, you can buy 8 Adam Smith ties. What I encourage you to do after this, please visit Morton's assistant, Andrew Green, at the entry. He'll be at the table there to purchase Adam Smith attire, ties for the gentlemen, and as you saw last month and the month before, beautiful scarves for the ladies. So we are as I said a moment ago, we're the sole exclusive seller of these accessories in the United States. You may also buy them online through our website. Mark Madsen, would you join us up here at the lectern? Mark is in our development office. He's an excellent member of our team. Again, none of this would be possible without the generous support of Leadership Institute donors. If you are interested in a tour of the Stephen P.J. Wood building, the building that we are sitting in right now, or the adjacent building in the 3030 space, I encourage you to see Mr. Madsen here at the close of this breakfast. He will be happy to give you a tour of our spaces here in Clarendon and answer any questions you may have. With that, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy Hanukkah, and we hope to see you on January 4th. Thank you. I was kidding. You don't have to change into that right now.
No, I'm going to. I'm going to. I almost bought one this morning.
This is actually the one, I bought this in 2009, so they hold up.